Welcome to the new Kevin Smith Great Witness Show. I'm Dean Bell, host, and we have Dean Kevin here today, and he'll be sharing his real side experiences with us. Hi, Kevin.
This real side experience would begin with me in the company of a large group of individuals. On this occasion, however, it wasn't a situation where we were sharing and promoting the ease, garnering agreement to the beneficial with all life, galactic projects, etc., but that I was a part of this large body of individuals who were seemingly held captive. The group I was with and a part of would be human in body type appearance. Where we were held captive would be an area that comprised overall of stone. The layout would be a central area open to the gloomy and forbidding skies above. Surrounding the central area would be a complexity of labyrinthian type passageways and tunnels. The passageway and tunnel sections had the feel of the kind of place a minotaur would dwell, and this part of the layout seemed to be more so underground. And so one would access this place from the surface, find themselves delving through the tunnels which would take them underground, and eventually would be found the central area, which, as it was open to the skies above, suggested that the tunnels led you underground to an extent. Then, as you proceeded, so would you gradually, at a certain point, be ascending upwards again, the tunnels taking you back to the surface and into this central section through a completely contained arena, as it were. The only way to extricate yourself from it would be back through the tunnels. But as I said, it wasn't a place open to random exploration. It was designed for containment purposes, and this large human group that I was affiliated with would be so contained in the central section. That which contained them seemed to be a group of beings whose body forms were rather hard to determine, for throughout the experience so would their body types be constantly changing, and changing to forms which were somewhat hard to define, with the references my personal self has available. Overall, though, their body type were reptilian, I would say, and this would make sense in regards to their fluctuating forms, as reptilians are masterful shapeshifters. And my impressions were that this particular group of humans had been retained here in this place for quite a while, and perhaps others would be added to the imprisoned group, but certainly once trapped here, so would it be an impossibility to leave, as the surrounding tunnels that led to the central section where the humans were placed would be heavily guarded and crawling with the reptilians, which made any chance of escape unlikely. And it wasn't just for containment purposes, it was also for the amusement of the reptilian type beings, as they would continually torture and abuse the human captives in the central area in all manner of creative ways. Such is the general proclivity of the ill-intended, their particular means of alleviating boredom for themselves in creation. Generally, the reptilian beings would assume forms then that would facilitate better their torture of the hapless humans. They would transform into huge beast-like creatures, lacerate them with a tooth and claw, but never dispatch them, as they seemed to prefer to keep the humans in perpetual states of torture, as opposed to just kill them. And so it would seem that my presence here was an attempt to liberate these humans, that I had assumed a position as one of the captives, and the reptilians hadn't realized I was in fact an infiltrator with this objective, and the humans contained here were somewhat demoralized, acquiescent, and in a state of complete surrender to their captors. Rather easy then that they would be continually contained. I would have to then endure the kind of tortures that the other humans had to suffer, as it was a case of not alerting the reptilians to the fact that I wasn't one of their suppressed captives, but here to assist them. Throughout my ordeals I shared with the humans, I would then be constantly speaking with them, though subtly, as these humans were so beaten down that they rarely spoke a word, if at all, and I was endeavouring to blend in and adopt similar mannerisms, although several times I was identified then as one who was somewhat more lively and animated than the other captives, and would be constantly made an example of in front of the humans, in an effort to impress upon them constantly the consequences for any kind of insurrection. And so a particular reptilian would assume the form of a kind of large, hairy beast creature, and maul me with its claws, tearing my body bloody. But I was persistent, and slowly was as though waking the humans from the consideration that they were imprisoned here beyond salvation, and resigned to their tortures. And this situation, the plight of these humans, could only be so through the agreements they had with their reptilian captors. The controlling reptilians have secured agreements through the overall consciousness, mostly subconscious, over eons of lifetimes, that allow that they can dominate, subjugate, torture, and eliminate all those who have extended this agreement, as the specific of the agreement is that which allows this subjugation and torture. It is an agreement contract based on a controller and controlled, slave and a slave master dynamic, and will play out accordingly in a simulation, as all involved have agreed that this is the game they wish to play with each other in creation. For as our simulation is exactly as we have decided it through the idea agreements in our consciousness, everything that takes place, including the ability of others to harm us, is all based on our choices. We can't change the consciousness and intent of another, but their ability to impact us is according to the extent that we allow them, like two computer game characters that are programmed in mutual agreement as to which will be more powerful than the other, etc. And the controllers have masterfully managed to trawl agreement through the consciousness that their characters have a power over the multitudes, and a simulation plays out accordingly. Most individuals then are completely the effects of these consciousness agreements, as they are fully personal self-immersed only, which is a full agreement with everything the consciousness comprises of, the idea agreements that make it up, which allow them to be continuously subjugated to control, expressed in all the ways it can, as in this example, and generally as the individual chooses to remain locked into the consciousness, to attempt to assist them would be an exercise in futility. For even if we save individuals from a reptilian stronghold, if the agreements are maintained that allowed the situation, and if such individuals remain with their consciousness, then these agreements are always maintained and can at any moment effect further situations of a similar nature, and so, after we have rescued them, they can simply be recaptured. So evidently here there must have been some sense in assisting these particular humans. Perhaps they were preparing to step up and begin their own awareness processes. This had been recognized by the dark forces, who had then locked them down in an effort to discourage them, but that the guides had facilitated my insertion into their affairs to attempt to assist them. Really, individuals have to assist themselves, as it is their agreements that dictate their simulation, and so, if I am able to assist in any capacity, it is an alteration of their own agreements that is facilitating the changing simulation from a capture to a possible extraction, and I can fulfill the role of a rescuer as their agreements allow. I can't rescue anyone if their agreements with their captors are such that there is no possibility of escape, as decided by the participants, captured and captors both. And if the captured decided they are incapable of escaping themselves, then this is their experience. But they might decide that they could escape, but only with the assistance of another, and so I can take that provided role and really play a part in the movie the captured humans are deciding upon. And in this case, it was more that the humans were not currently in agreement to be rescued, but may come around to doing so if I encouraged them to effectively change their simulated movie script. And so, even though I didn't have agreements which allowed these particular reptilians to exercise a power over me, that through a real awareness, unshackled by agreements clung to, that prevent its abilities where defending its personal created self is concerned, that the real awareness could then have ensured the personal self's safety in this situation. It was more that it was allowed that the personal self go through this ordeal, as I said, to blend in, that the reptilians would assume me a part of their enslaved human group, so I could take the time to encourage the humans to really alter their agreements that would facilitate their rescue. As I said, it was rather a simulated situation between these two overall groups, a game of their making, so I was somewhat playing by their decided parameters, as much as their agreements would permit me, as though the real awareness had found agreements in my consciousness that connected with the consciousness of those involved, where I could enter this real side simulated situation, and in regards to the controlling reptilians, not so difficult, as agreements to them are throughout all consciousness, so it's an open door to any of their creations or the creations they are involved with. But with these real side situations, they can be rather like games within the overall simulator game, and every game has its own rule set and decided parameters as you play it, that you rather are resigned to, almost like my entering any computer game and choosing to be one of the captives as a role, and the simulation rolls out accordingly. If I want to play a certain game, I have to upload the idea of it and be affected into its simulation, and if I choose to not operate within the parameters, the rules, the decided game design, then what I do may not make sense to those whose game it is, and my effectiveness in making a contact or engaging with the humans be less likely. And if it is a game then designed between these reptilians and the human slaves, if the game is to change, so must the agreements that affect the game be altered, and even though the humans may not realize this, the game depends on their agreements also that it be as it is, and we can on occasion be more forceful. We can destroy controlling ideas and creations if the particular circumstances are right. We can be the effects that are the nature of such distortions, as destructive ideas are reflected effects of self-destruction waiting to happen. But sometimes this can't always be so, and the real awareness knows when it can dismantle ideas or when to just play along with them. And if we do deconstruct a decided game when really we perhaps should not have, we can take on more karma, more effects than was necessary. For after all, it is the free will of the participants as to what experience they will share, and so really the extent of our decided involvement always lies with the individuals whose created simulation we are entering. And on this occasion the best course of action was to play along, to be a captive human and be tortured, etc., as I continuously encouraged the humans to extricate themselves. This place did seem also somewhat familiar, as though I had been here before, and the idea was to eventually bolster the humans' courage enough that we would attempt an exodus. I would lead the humans to safety back through the tunnels and to the surface. There would be a brief, overlapping scene that coincided with the continued happenings in this containment complex, whereby I was exploring throughout the complex tunnel systems that surrounded and led to the central area. But this overlapping scene was at a moment where the tunnels, the passageways, and the central area were devoid of any other beings, reptilians and human captives alike, and so exploration could be so without reptilian entanglements or incidents, as though this were an exploration taking place prior to the current experience with the humans, to familiarize myself with and determine how to exit this stone complex efficiently. And this is perhaps where the familiarity of these caves came from, for this prior exploration would have occurred at an earlier point, and evidently an experience I had either forgotten or that the personal self wasn't shown. And then another overlapping scene of a further exploration at a moment where the tunnels were now full of the reptilian beings, that I had to negotiate through the passageways, but do my best to avoid the reptilians, to choose the best route which yielded as little as was possible, and engaging with them. So it seemed to be a series of escalating experiences that had me first able to fully explore the tunnels without risk or concern of resistance, and then, armed with the geographical layout of the tunnels, so would I then be familiar with them to the extent that I would be more adept at being able to pick my way through the passageways when they happened to be crawling with reptilians, to be able to take alternative routes, etc., without the risk of getting lost. The real awareness would know of the tunnels and their layout, as it is through all consciousness and all simulation effected from it, and so that I had to learn the tunnel layout suggested that the personal self wouldn't have access to the real awareness impressions as to the layout at the time of the Exodus, or that it would be a situation where the real awareness simply operates as it does, with the personal self just along for the ride, the personal self with no knowledge of the tunnels, and yet they are easily navigated. So either the real awareness wouldn't afford these impressions, or would be unable, that it might become a personal self-simulated experience without the input and know-how afforded by the real awareness. Perhaps the ordeal would be a little personal self-traumatic, and so anything activated through the vehicles of the created self that will withdraw from the standing in the nowness of the real awareness, where tunnel layouts can be known, make it necessary that the personal self had to learn the tunnel layout for itself, and have that as a personal reference to draw upon when the real awareness knowing of everything creational would be unavailable. Ultimately, I would never get to the stage where I was leading the humans to safety, but it was progressing to that point. The real task was encouraging them enough to even want to make the attempt, and that would take the moments that it would, and the scene would end there, with me still as an infiltrator under the reptilian radar, with them assuming I was simply one of their captive humans, though perhaps a little more animated than the rest, and continually being punished for being so, for being a rebel rouser, amongst all the other continuous torture that I and the rest of the humans had to endure. And perhaps I will be shown more of this experience at a later moment, to see the culmination of my efforts, and if I was indeed successful.
Okay, Kevin, first experience. You were on a rescue mission here, and that's kind of like what we're doing here with the new presentation, is we're sharing what we're doing and seeing if anybody wants to be so-called rescued. But it does take agreement, like you indicated in your experience, even though people can so-called be rescued, their lack of agreement to be rescued or to wake up to more can drag them back into captivity or restrictions or creation, whatever you want to call it. So it really does take them, they really need to decide to want to wake up to something more. And that's what you're trying to do here, persuade them in some way, or to give them hints to do it for themselves, basically. We can only do that. We can't do it for them. They have to do it for themselves. Each one of us does have to do that. And it shows, your experience shows also how agreement is really important to all of us, and what we have to be careful, you could say, what we're agreeing to, because it's not always in our benefit to agree to certain things. But as we move on, become more aware, we are consciously agreeing to certain things, consciously being effect to certain things, and that makes a lot more sense. Then we have more options to maneuver in creation, so that it is a benefit rather than an unconscious agreement to something that's not a benefit. So part of this is, I see very important as the agreement that we have to support each other is actually the real universes, or the real isness that life is. So that support we give to each other, that actually is the meaty part of this. And that's where we become more aware as we support each other.
In this experience, I would say it was more a personal one of facing the created self and all that makes up its construction, a personal self that affects a creation that we have to face also, the effects generated through the personal self. Unless we become aware of and face what we have created, we remain its unconscious prisoner, resigned to cause and effect creation. And so I started off on the first floor of my house on the real side, the personal self, in other words, and there would be in my presence so very much agreement for them to be there and feature in my experience, the real guides, though in the forms of my brother Gary and my father Peter, but their telltale isness standing real signatures would reveal them to be the guides adopting these forms. Very often the guides assume the form of my grandfather, sometimes my brother, and this is fairly typical, that the guides feature in the forms of older siblings and those that are in the roles of the older generations in our current personal self, lifetime families. There was rather a disagreement along the lines of something that I was at a stage in my process that I must face, and perhaps a little reluctance or hesitation on the part of my personal self. My personal self became rather attitude infused and irate as the guides bore this patiently. The first floor of my house was also full of computers, and I would secure a huge axe from a nearby wall where it was attached and proceed to destroy these computers. My reasoning was this, that there was a part of my personal self I had to face, yes, but something seemed to be unduly affecting my ability to deal with this aspect of the personal self, some influence or other. For yes, we all are constantly influenced to remain in creation, and to do that which is detrimental to our real awareness and is recognition. But this was perhaps an additional influence, and the source of which was the technology, specifically the computers, to which on the physical I'm extensively engaging with as I share what I do. And so I would take my axe to these computers that featured here in my house, as though to destroy that which was influencing me to not proceed with another step in my awareness process. For of course, all technology is a dark force created, is a black magic distortion, and any interaction with it is bound to affect us with all manner of subliminals, etc. With the real awareness, we can rather mitigate the effects, but nevertheless, It is an additional situation we have to deal with. After all, we did all agree with the tech, so we rather have to deal with it. I would storm from the house. The guides would watch me go, perhaps realizing that I was just having one of my moments, like a stroppy child having a tantrum. I would go a-wandering on the real side, and as is generally the case, I will get a handle on the personal self, get it under control, and step aside from its thoughts and emotions, and now I'm in my real awareness and objective to the personal self. I would find myself in the woods, perhaps even a hint that while being immersed in the personal self, you can't see the wood for the trees, as the saying goes. You don't get the greater oversight of the real awareness, the entire wood, as you focus too much on the pieces of the created personal self, the trees. But anyway, I came across a delightful wood cabin, and my real awareness knew who dwelled here, and that I had agreement with the individual to enter, and so I would. For this was one of Tim's places on the real side. Tim is another new friend, and on occasion I will visit him in this very cabin. On this occasion, Tim seemed to be suffering from a sickness. He was rather resigned to his bed in the cabin, and as he spoke about recently on the Skypes around the time of the sharing of this experience, he has been the recipient of a cold that he suspected may be 5G related. Here we see then how the physical level afflictions can translate on the real side through the other body vehicles. Or maybe the other way around, everything stemming from the real side in fact, and manifesting on the physical being the dumping ground and arena of all that we decide and agree with through our 5 bodies. Nevertheless, we would converse for a time, but then it's as though that which I was supposed to be facing, that which I had walked away from earlier, rather caught up with me. In fact, it burst into Tim's very cabin, and presented as absolute mayhem. The cabin now filled with individuals, creatures, reptilians. It was as though the entire cabin scene fragmented, and was interspersed with 1,000 other scenes and settings, all woven together, like 1,000 movies, all meshed together, with all the corresponding characters. Tim was rather bemused, and I informed him that this was my created consciousness mess that I was supposed to deal with, and I would bid Tim farewell for now, and exit the cabin. I was a little overwhelmed again with all the mania of the situation. As all this created a consciousness agreement taplining mess, manifesting as the scenes and characters involved with these agreements, whenever or wherever they were forged, re-established itself in the woodland environment around me. I fled again through the woodland, It was as though I was trying to run from my past, my created consciousness, rather than deal with it, but actually more so, that it was too much to deal with all in one go, as though my reluctance to deal with a certain aspect of my created consciousness had caused a kind of backlog, a build-up, like a steady flow of scummy water that you have to keep dealing with, or it builds up, and if you keep on top of it, and in fact empty the sink that it's pouring into, you can even turn the tap off when you have reached the point where you have faced everything the scummy water represents. Then you're at a point where you decide to turn it back on or leave it off. The empty sink, devoid of scummy water, if we get that far, is our standing in our real awareness, unrestricted from a created consciousness we now are fully aware of, have fully faced, and we decide what of a creation we want to consciously be the effects of or not. We decide to turn on the tap, as it were. And so, as I ran, it was more so that I was rather dealing with the backlog, sorting out the mess of a certain agreement that I must face, that interweaved itself through all manner of lifetimes, experiences, and involving all manner of individuals, to tease the specific agreement out that was the common underlying theme and cause amidst the mess. For from all this mass of imagery and such would emerge a single individual, as everything else would fade away, a woman pursuing me, and this specifically then was what I had to face, a situation that involved her, from who knew where or when in my creational experience. I would thus skid to a halt in an open field beyond the woodland, representing an open, clear, and expansive real awareness view beyond the obfuscation of the trees. For I now switched to an objective view, watching my personal self from a third-person perspective, and would see a scene played out, or at least the final act of it, from wherever lifetime it had, that incorporated this woman. At the same time, I would receive real awareness, additional information, and background detail as to what had led up to what I witnessed here. For this woman had been a witch or some practitioner of the dark arts of magic, and my personal self had become affiliated with her or her practice at that time, but I had rather betrayed or tricked her in some fashion and stole her secrets for myself. This had culminated in her tracking me down, and using her dark magics, she was able to exact her revenge. She did this by forcing me, through her will, to kill myself. This is what I would witness in this final, played-out scene, for I would watch myself take out a sort of razor blade and cut my own wrists, as though unable to prevent myself from doing so. Such was the agreement to this woman's power over me. The scene faded from view, and my real awareness knew that this event had ingrained itself strongly in my subconscious. The nature of it was this, that every time I would be in a position where my personal self had achieved a great goal, or whatever it considered to be such, in the lifetimes beyond the one that involved this witch, that I would self-sabotage, self-destruct, as though an agreement was formed that I would be destroyed every time I achieved a certain thing that my personal self considered of significance. And thus this agreement, forged from the lifetime with this witch, of death following the acquisition of a great knowledge or prestige, would set a cause and effect, unconscious, automatic, self-decided destruction that would follow every time I would aspire to something. This is the agreement, then, that I had to face and release, for once again I was reaching a point in my process of awareness in this lifetime where this old planted agreement seed was reaching through the lifetimes and bringing on this impulse to self-destruct. For over the last several weeks leading up to this real side experience, I had felt the stirrings of it, but not understanding why, and so evidently it was a time to address this agreement ingrained programmed pattern of self-sabotage before it manifested as interference or even halting my process. So another example of, after a little personal self-reluctance and with a little adverse technological computer-orientated influencing, I would finally agree to face this agreement tapline. I would see the final scene and have an overview of the lifetime involving the witch and her forcing my suicide with her magics. I would understand how this event had manifested in the experience being stored with the subconscious additional agreement tapline consideration, that of self-sabotage following success in whatever form that took, and now could decide its release, and I would do so before patterns of behaviour reassert themselves again, based on this unconscious agreement. And so the process of continually facing the self and becoming fully aware of everything that makes up its created consciousness construction rolls on.
Okay, Kevin, second experience. Thank you for sharing that. So, we decide basically what we want to do in creation. Our decision is important. Otherwise, we're just wandering along without a purpose. So this decision to somehow relate to life in a way that makes sense and is a benefit to everybody, that's important. For you, the experience with the computers and destroying them, I see it as the literal part of ourselves. To me, my desires more, I would say, keep me back than my literal self. It's more feelings, feeling aspect can be tricky for me personally, so I have to watch that. Although, if we keep the focus on the isness that life is, it works out, no matter what, because it's that intent that works to your advantage. And even if you get sidetracked for a while, you can recover because of your intent. And you said we decide what creation we want to be affected by, and that's what my last comment too is. We decide what we want to agree to and be affected by. But it's a conscious agreement, so that it's not something running in the background that's affecting us and we don't see it. And then we get blindsided, and we get stressed out, lose our focus, and things get dramatic, and we lose our way, get upset. So consciously, the more conscious we are about what we decide, the better off we are. You talk about the process of continually facing the self and becoming fully aware of everything that makes up, it creates the consciousness construction. My note's a little fuzzy here, but the process of continually facing the self and becoming fully aware. So we find that process, each of us find our unique process of continually waking up to this unknown quality of what this life, this isness, that it's a constant going into the unknown, hence the risk taker aspect of it. And pretty soon we get on track with who we are and how we relate to this isness, this life that just is. Before that, it's a struggle to find out what it is, where we are and who we are. And that's why we initially have these spiritual paths and religions and philosophies and metaphysics and all that. But these are just hints and guidelines and references. That we're in a new day now, and it's time to leave those ideas behind. We can always retrieve them if we want, but now we have to take it upon ourselves to use those references that move on to something that's more real, that has a real purpose. So that's it for me, Kevin. Thanks again for sharing your experiences. Very, very good. Actually, I'm sharing them with some of the people I know, and hopefully they'll see more of what you experience and how you relate it, which is really cool the way you interpret it, because you really go in and refine it and redefine it, and it really helps people to see it from many different viewpoints. So thanks, Kevin.